We are Jeff and Kathy Teichert with Love in Later Years. And today on LilyPod, we have Dr. Sean Brotherson, and Jeff's going to introduce him as our guest.
Sean has dual bachelor's degrees from BYU in English and Family Science, and a master's degree in Family Science also from BYU. He has a PhD in Family Science from Oregon State University, and he is a state extension specialist. Is that right, Sean?
That's right, and professor, yep, at North Dakota State University.
And professor at North Dakota State University in the family science field. And his programming and research is on parenting and fatherhood, healthy marriage, grief and loss, family stress and transitions, early childhood education, prevention, science, and family life education programs. We wanted to bring him on because several of these topics overlap the work that we do and also the book that we've written. And we invited Sean to be a beta reader for our book as well as an editor. And he gave us a lot of helpful suggestions in that role. So I'd also like to say by way of disclaimer that I've been good friends with Sean for 33 years. I know him better than he would probably like, but I can also tell you that he married the first girl he ever kissed. So anyway, to our listeners, hope you enjoy that little tidbit.
And
welcome, Sean.
He came all the way to our wedding
Right.
from North Dakota, and that was so fun to have him here for that. Sean, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you on LilyPod this afternoon. I'm coming to you, as you can see, from sunny Hawaii, but really in North Dakota. This is just my Zoom background today. So for all of you who dream of getting away for a few days to Hawaii, you can gaze upon my background today, and you too can wish that you were somewhere on a tropical beach while really being in your home wherever you are located. So
that's great.
If anybody watches this on YouTube and wonders why he's wearing a sweater on the beach, now you know.
Although I should say the weather has been lovely in North Dakota as well. So we're just getting into the fall colors here, I'm sure, as you are in Utah, and would remind people it's a great time of year to get out and see fall colors if that's an opportunity.
Definitely.
In your area.
It's beautiful colors this time of year.
For sure.
Yep.
We're in Utah.
Sometime.
We're in Utah, so.
All right. So to launch into the interview and the questions, as a family science professor and as a bishop, I didn't mention he was a bishop in the church for 5 years, but as a family science professor and as a bishop, what challenges have you seen for single parents, whether or not the other parent's in the picture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. I'm teaching a parenting class right now. I teach it regularly at the college level, as well as a lot of community education parenting classes. And I guess I'd say that parenting is probably the most demanding job that we can take on in life, for which we might have limited preparation. We don't require, like we require someone to go through some training when they're getting a driver's license, but we don't require them to go through the same type of training when they are stepping into the role of being a parent. Single parents often face the tasks involved in parenting, feeling insufficient in their preparation to handle many of those tasks. But I think that's true for really parents in any situation, whether you are partnered or not. But for example, think about it. If you're a single father and you are tasked with the challenge of raising 2 school-age girls who become teenagers and they don't have the daily guidance of a mother in the home to assist them, as a parent, you might feel somewhat insufficient to the tasks that are facing you. Kathy, as you've had 2 boys, for example, you've probably felt some of those feelings at times. And so that's where education comes in, and mentoring from other parents is really important, because most parents are capable of being able to meet those tasks, but we need to grow. Parenting is a developmental experience. And we often don't think of it that way. We think we just step into that role and we're supposed to be able to perform, but it's very much a developmental experience for us. So I'd say just that is really one of the first big challenges, is feeling up to the task and getting the preparation, education, mentoring that's going to help you to be able to be a healthy parent. The other thing is, another major challenge I've seen in the case of single parents is they tend to feel more isolated from others, including fellow church members of their Latter-day Saints. And so they experience a less rigorous support system to meet the daily challenges that come with parenting. Parenting is a stressful experience with challenges that happen every day. And it demands your patience, your attention, and your problem solving. And when someone is married or they're partnered in a healthy way with someone else, then they can rely on each other for support. You can use a tag team approach to handle basic tasks. For example, getting some food on the table for a family meal. I'll reference my own parenting experience. I'm a father of 8 children. My wife and I have had 8 kids. We're still raising those kids with 5 at home. And so just getting a meal on the table at night sometimes is the task, right? And sometimes one of us needs to tag the other one and say, okay, your turn tonight. But single parenting, and that term basically refers to your partner status. It too often results in the feeling of what you might call solo parenting, which is the idea of going through the parenting experience with only yourself as the resource to your kids. And that can be exhausting, and it can be discouraging. So, instead of going through kind of a solo parenting experience, if you can develop a reliable and healthy support network, that's a really critical element for those who are parenting while single. And those individuals in your support network, they can include a current or former partner if that relationship is healthy. It can be family members such as siblings, parents, other family members, friends, fellow church members. But to me, a healthy support network, it's kind of like a trampoline to help you bounce back during times of struggle or difficulty. So sometimes feeling the lack of that support network and also doing explicit things to develop that support network is really important, I think, because social support is one of the key things that we look at for single parents and their well-being, and also to their healthy parenting efforts. It's really, really important. So I'd say that's kind of a couple of the major challenges I would reference, I guess, maybe more from a spiritual perspective, and in my experience with counseling people in that role, as someone who's been an ecclesiastic leader. One of the consequences I've observed in the life of single parents is that there's often a fairly difficult or painful or even toxic relationship with a former partner that they need to deal with. And that just complicates their parenting experience. It can complicate something as simple as, you have a teenage child who's going to participate in a church-sponsored activity, but it's scheduled to occur during the other parent's parenting time. Or it might involve, you may be at odds with that other parent, and that parent is getting the child to take sides, or they might speak negatively about you in front of the kids. So sometimes you and your kids are placed in a situation where you're harmed or you're hurt by that former partner's bad choices or bad behavior. And so from a perspective of those who are close to or supportive of someone in that single parent situation, just being attentive to that potential or occurring reality in the life of someone who is single, I think is really critical in lending support. I get maybe one other thing that I've seen is that a fairly common outcome of the single parenting experience is it can take a toll on your spiritual stability. And by that, I mean, if someone enters the single parent experience as a result of divorce, for example, divorce itself is a very stressful transition that often destabilizes your life for a period of time. For example, I've had conversations with Jeff, and he said, when I went through X divorce experience, I found myself just kind of struggling to kind of keep life together for a period of time after going through that really difficult transition. And so it can take a toll just on your spiritual life and your activity level. Life already feels pretty exhausting during that kind of time period. So if you're doing basic, spiritual activities like attending church or fulfilling church assignments, that can start to feel pretty overwhelming. So communicating about that situation with your church leaders can help. So if adjustments need to be made, that's important, and just focusing on spiritual practices that are going to help sustain you is helpful. But those are some of the challenges that I've seen, Jeff and Kathy, in that particular context. And I know that you address some of those specifics, in your forthcoming book, Intentional Courtship. How does the experience of becoming a single parent affect your spiritual life? And what are the elements of your spiritual life that you want to attend to, but also others should be sensitive to when you're going through that experience. So I think that's important.
So I have a follow-up to this, all great information. And I was just thinking of the double whammy placed on single parents. If they're socially isolated and not getting as much support as partnered couples, and they don't have their partner, that's a lot of effort they have to make to go and create their own network, which you're saying is important. So have you seen in your own ward how that has worked, if they've done things that were creative to get that support? Because sometimes they might not have family around. I'm sure each person's situation is different, but I'm just wondering if you could cite any examples or maybe any ways that you think we could give the listeners to create that support system for themselves.
Yeah, I think there are certainly mechanisms within the Latter-day Saint setting that allow for those support systems to be in place and to be nurtured. I think sometimes they're going to be formal. For example, we know that that among the adult members of the church that there are ministering assignments that exist. And for example, my wife for a number of years has had a ministering assignment, and I support her in that with a sister who's gone through a divorce experience. And they go to lunch regularly. A lot of the support that is extended there, it's even though there's a formal assignment, it's very informal support. It's, hey, you're raising a child and your child is graduating from high school now during COVID. Can I help you with that? Can I be there for you? Sometimes it's as simple as, hey, let's go grab some lunch and tell me how things are going as you're going through this transition experience. What are your plans? So
you're encouraging people to show up in that capacity. Hopefully we have some listeners that will take that to heart and be more aware of the single parents in their area. And then I guess on the other side, if you're single and you're ministering, families aren't reaching out, you could reach out to them. That's harder. I think it's always easier when someone reaches out and have a hand of fellowship, but I like to empower mid-singles to create the life they want and be willing to go out of their comfort zone, even if it means asking for help.
Yeah, and I think you speak to a reality, Kathy, which is, I think, just part of the fabric of human experience, is that we often do not necessarily know how to be supportive to or minister to someone whose experience is unlike our own. And certainly that can be true if you've gone through a divorce experience or a widowhood experience or something else. It's not that people around you don't care about you, but they may be very uncertain or even uncomfortable with trying to figure out how to be supportive to you. They don't have a script, that tells them how to help someone through this kind of experience. My dissertation research was about loss of a child, and it was very interesting. Parents who I interviewed often said, well, I joined the club that nobody wants to join, right?
Right.
Like I didn't sign up for this, but now I'm in it, and I'm going to be in it for the rest of my life. And I noticed that not only, I mean, I didn't want to join it, but now people don't know how to treat the people who were part of that club. They don't really know how to help us. So it's actually helpful for me to talk to people who are in the, parent who lost a child club, because at least they get it, right? And I think the same is often true for those who are trying to support one another, whether in a familial or an ecclesiastical setting, is they simply don't have a script that tells them, this is what someone is going through, this is what they're experiencing with their kids, or maybe with a former partner, and how you might be helpful in that situation. And so I think you're very right. Communicating explicitly and clearly about some of those needs can really be helpful to people who want to be a support, but they may not have an understanding of what is going to really be meaningful
Right.
to you in that
And
situation.
I think that we want to have our book become that thing that can help loved ones understand. So we hope not just mid-singles, but those who love and care for mid-singles will read it and gain a better understanding. And so I gained from your answer that mid-singles can support each other because they understand each other. They're in that club that they never wanted to be in. But we can also help teach those around us how to love and serve us better, because they probably want to, they just don't know how. And so we can help them to do that by being honest about our situation and what we need.
Right. And that was one of the things I really appreciate about you and Jeff being willing to address the topic of individuals who are experiencing the single life as adults and in the Latter-day Saint faith, is that it brings that population, so to speak, more to the forefront, and helps us think about what are their needs, what are their aspirations, what are there's a youth development expert who I study quite a bit, who often says of youth, who we think of as teenagers are a problem, and he said, and his biggest message is, teenagers are a tremendous resource. They're amazing in their potential and what they can do. Let's reframe how we think about that. Well, I think the same is true of the population of individuals who are Latter-day Saints that are single. Whatever their stage of life, they're not a problem. They are a tremendous resource to the church, to their families, to their communities. We need to see them in that light and invite them, to kind of fulfill those possibilities. And of course, many of them, that's exactly what they're doing already. But for those of us who aren't single, help us to see that and help us to find ways to support them in that, in a meaningful way.
Right.
Much of the best counsel and advice I got going through it was from other people who had been divorced and come out the other end and remarried and had happy lives. And I felt like, they were the most real with me in a lot of ways about what was going on. And at the same time, I want to say this to other people who may listen to this, who are listening more because they have a loved one or something like that that's going through it. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable to talk with a mid-single about the pain they are experiencing or have experienced, because I don't know what to do about it. I haven't been through that, or I'm not a professional counselor or anything like that. And one thing I would say is, you don't have to be a professional counselor. You don't have to be especially trained to invite someone over to watch a basketball game and get some pizza and feel normal.
And sometimes that's the best thing you can do,
Right.
is just do something normal.
Having said that, I want to ask you to address I know when Kathy was was divorced, both of us had divorces, in fact, that were not our choice. But Kathy was faced with a situation where she had never really earned a living. And
Well, not fully supported myself, that is.
right, her former husband had, is a decent father in many ways, and he has the kids about half the time. And so from that standpoint, there was some support and, sharing the kids back and forth and so on. But
And that helped a lot, but it creates its own challenges. There's pros and cons to shared custody.
right. And she had to figure out, all right, how am I going to support myself for the rest of my life? Because this husband is no longer going to do that completely. And child support was not going to be enough to live on, really. And then how am I going to manage to balance that with raising two young children, even if I only have them half the time? And so I think there was a tremendous sense in the beginning with Kathy of feeling this overwhelm. And I think for me, it was, well, for her, it was my career hasn't started. For me, it was like my career's in the toilet because my mind has been on other things while I went through my divorce. And I was running a business. And so I had a tremendous sense of overwhelm, and you experienced me talking about that sometimes. So what I would like to ask you then is, for our listeners who are experiencing a great sense of overwhelm, like, oh my gosh, life is too much for me. There's too many things coming at me. I mean, for me, I couldn't even open my mail. I mean, there was so much anxiety about, I don't want to even know what's in it, and it just feels like it continues to pile up faster than I can deal with it.
And for me, I was superwoman. I showed up in the role of mom and dad, provider, nurturer, all of it. I just took over and I did all of it, and I wore myself out.
Yeah, her health went into a serious tailspin for a while. So what would you suggest to single parents or, mid-singles who are dealing with this feeling that life is overwhelming, that things come at me faster than I can deal with them, and just feel no hope?
Yeah, very good question. I've spent the last 6 or 7 years in my professional work. I'm working with highly stressed populations, in this case, farm and ranch populations, as well as some others.
Right.
And in those circumstances, people are often dealing with extreme stresses that are beyond their immediate control. And when you are dealing with stresses that feel like they're beyond your ability to influence, then you start to feel overwhelmed. How can I cope with something that I can't control? I don't have control over, right? And so trying to figure out, how do you help someone who feels like they're drowning, and they're trying to figure out, where are my lifelines? That's an extremely challenging situation. But one of the things that I think is really important is to realize the importance of your health in those situations. And any person, if they are looking at their familial situation, their individual situation, they can sit down and, take stock of their life and say, okay, what are the assets that are available to me? And it's interesting because, it's very common for those who are working in that industry of farming and ranching to sit down and say, my assets include land, buildings, equipment, livestock, seed, things like that, things that are essential to their life and their business, so to speak, that they count on as resources to help them be successful. But almost never do they include health, individual health and relationship health as key resources. And yet I would argue that actually health, individual health and relationship health, are the most important resources for the success of their family experience and their business operation. And in fact, I make that argument in pretty much every every news interview that I do, every article that I write, that that your health is your most important resource. And so prioritizing your physical health and your mental health, your spiritual health, making sure that you are doing the self-care that is needed for your health to be able to function well. I think that is priority number one. I think, Kathy, I mean, early on when I met you, we were talking a little bit about health issues. And I think I said, well, I'm a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm quote a doctor of, family well-being. And I said, I'm going to write you a prescription to basically focus on your health. It needs to be a big priority.
Actually, your prescription was relax more, stress less, or stress less, relax more. I don't remember the order, but I did write it on my fridge and I said it for a year, and I did. I did it, and it helped.
And yeah, and that's the thing. Stress actually takes a really big toll on health, and it can take a really big toll on family relationships. And so
well, and I found that stress isn't as much a function of what's being thrown at you, but a function of what you're thinking about that. Because I have a very full plate, but I actually am trying to see myself as not all that busy. That I have options, that I have all the time that I need. And it helps a lot when I think that way, rather than think I'm so overwhelmed, I'm so stressed,
right.
Because those are disempowering, and they can cause overwhelm and stress in our bodies that we cannot, that we can shift if we change our thoughts about it. And, your answer reminded me of the concept of don't kill the goose that laid the golden eggs, that our children, our communities, our own sphere of influence is affected by how well we're able to perform our duties. And we can't do that if we're not taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, in your book, Intentional Courtship, that's one of the things I think is somewhat unique and that was very engaging to me, is that that you address specifically this issue of, and of course you're talking about, the possibility of finding a marriage partner and happiness in that life experience, and the power of your thoughts in being able to either prepare you for that possibility and be more successful in that, or the power of your thoughts in being able to in a sense disempower you, or to obstruct your path to having a more successful experience with that family possibility. And I think, again, the same is very true in the way we think about the stress we experience and the resources available to us. For example, if you say to yourself, well, in the LDS faith community, they're just so focused on whole families rather than families that have gone through a break or a difficult transition. They're not going to be able to be a resource to us. I can't go there. I'm just going to, draw a line through that possibility. Well, versus seen as, oh no, there's a lot of resource there, but I need to help unlock that.
Right. Well, and some might have a bad experience and think,
sure,
the entire ward doesn't appreciate my situation. They don't understand me. And you write off everyone by one or two bad experiences, where every person in the ward is a different person and has a different capacity to be helpful. And I like what you said, unlock the possible resources that are there.
Yeah, and sometimes when we deal with stress, what happens, going back to what you were saying about how we perceive what we were experiencing, is we start to problematize everything. So problematizing means that we adopt a negative interpretation of every possible experience that we're having with something or the world around us, and it immediately elevates the stress level rather than diminishing your stress level. And it's it's not only what we're experiencing, but our perception of what we're experiencing and how we're reacting to it that actually becomes more problematic. And of course, that takes an enormous toll on our mental health and our spiritual health and how we interact with others, therefore our relationship health.
Right. And the opposite of problematizing would be looking at life for all its possibilities and looking for solutions, being solution focused.
Right.
One thing I find interesting that you're working on farm stress, and the country is going through a big drought right now, and that's obviously affecting many farmers, and it deeply affects them, and yet they have really no control over it whatsoever. And that is sort of that difficult situation where, yes, I have something that's happening, but it's completely outside my agency. It might as well be a cancer diagnosis, or, there would be more you could do with that even than with the drought. I think of this, partly because, and this is for the benefit of our listeners, both Sean and I, even though we grew up in the city in Orem, we were sent when we were teenagers to work on our family ranches. My family's was near Cokeville, Wyoming, and Sean's was near Altamont, Utah. And so we both have some background working cattle and moving sprinkler pipe and all that kind of stuff. And I guess, when I think about the kind of stress that farmers are going through, and I mean, I read somewhere recently that their suicide rate was like triple the national average recently or something like that. I had an experience recently in church where we were talking about that scripture, where he that refuses to support his family is worse than an infidel and has denied the faith. And somebody brought up the point that some people don't refuse to work to feed their family, but simply find it hard and have mental health issues and whatever. And a member of our ward who had grown up on a farm says, I can't believe what I'm hearing. When I was a kid, I grew up on this ranch, and if you didn't go out and feed your cows in the winter, they were going to die no matter how bad you felt. And I think, while that is true, and while that is a motivation to get your butt out of bed and go feed your cows, it's also kind of missing the point that your mental health does matter. It matters to yourself and it matters to your cows. Because sure, I mean, anybody can get up out of bed as long as they're not, dead. They can get up and go push themselves out the door to go feed some cows. But if you're miserable, you're not really paying as much attention to those cows. You're not noticing that one of them is about to give birth, things like that. So I guess my question is, when someone's in the middle of that stress, we know it's best not to worry about things they have no control over. But when that thing we have no control over deeply affects us, what do you recommend to that person? My husband is leaving. I don't want him to, but he's made up his mind, whatever that situation might be.
There's a very interesting piece of spiritual wisdom, I guess I would say, that was offered by President Russell M. Nelson not too long ago in a general conference talk, where he was referring to the experience of joy and the potential for joy in life. And he said, I think very deliberately and explicitly, that our experience of joy in life, and of course, family life is something that we want to experience joy in. He says, but it has much less to do with what we are experiencing than it has to do with our focus. And specifically, of course, he's referring to our spiritual focus and our connection with the Savior. But I mean, there's some profound implications of that for our mental health and our relationship health, including that even when you are experiencing something that's outside of your control, you can seek to exercise some control over what are the things within your immediate control. And one of the things that I do with a lot of these populations that I'm working with is try to help them understand that while there are many things outside of their immediate control, they can make a lot of daily choices in their own health, that actually a lot of things that we do for our health, like for example, trying to improve our sleep and the rewards that come from that, trying to focus on our diet, trying to focus on our exercise and other things. There's a whole variety of things that you can do that are actually extremely beneficial for your health. They don't cost a lot of money, and they pay tremendous dividends. They're a tremendous investment in health as your most important resource that you rely on to be. And what's really critical to understand is health is the resource that we rely on, not the only one, but probably the most important one, to get through difficult times, to be resilient when we're affected by things that are very challenging. And so, and I think, it's interesting as I've gotten older, and work in my field, it's interesting to reflect on how many things from a spiritual perspective, within the gospel are designed to optimize our health, not to necessarily remove life difficulties, but to make us more resilient in the face of the difficulties that we will experience, right? Make us more able to have health circumstances that are going to help us through those things. And when I talked earlier about social support, that's a very essential element of our relationship health, is having connected, caring relationships and being able to rely on those when we need a boost, when we need assistance, whether it's someone to help with a child when we need some respite care, or someone to sit down with us and say, hey, let's just have a meal or watch a game, or have a talk when we need an adult who can just listen to us share our heart. So I guess those are some of the thoughts that I would share related to that.
Awesome. And I've thought a lot about the fact that Jesus healed people before he ministered to them. And it's interesting that you would bring up that scriptures tend to help us be more healthy, more resilient, probably so that we can be more receptive to the Spirit. Because I know when I was really, really sick, and like my stomach wasn't working, my brain wasn't working very well, because they're very closely connected. It was super hard for me to feel the Spirit. And I had gone like a month or about a year before to the temple every week. I always felt inspired. I always felt the Spirit. I felt personal revelation working in my life. But when I was really, really, really sick, it just wasn't there. And that's another thing is that he also experienced that loss of spirit. And I think that's because we sometimes experience that in life when we have something really traumatic happen, or when we're really, really ill. And sometimes it's during those moments that our resilience comes from previous experiences with the Spirit that we can recall, or maybe even relying on other people's hope for a while.
Yeah, very much. And I mean, that concept of healing, there's so much of that that's embedded in the gospel. And of course, someone who goes through life experiences, if you're single, there may be experiences that you've passed through in life that have been very wounding, and so healing is something that may be at the forefront of what you're concerned about in your life. What are some things that I've experienced that I need to heal from? Or you have concerns for people around you, your children, for example. Have they been wounded by experiences that were not of their own choosing, and yet they have been hurt by some things? They've experienced difficulty. And of course, that's one of the topics that you guys address to a degree in intentional courtship. If you're a parent and you've gone through a difficult divorce experience, you might feel like, hey, my children have been wounded by this experience, and I didn't choose that for them. It's not what I wanted for them, but unfortunately it's what I've experienced and what they have now experienced. And how can I help them to be resilient or to be less wounded by it? And so healing is very much something that you need to think about and that you need to address at times in your own experience. Because even though we desire to be healthy, there's times where we experience things that are unhealthy, and we have to think about how do we move in that direction and what's going to help us to do that.
Right.
And
And radical acceptance with what we can't control, and then looking for the solutions in what we can control is like the serenity prayer. That's a big help, I think, for anyone who's a mid-single to remember what is in their power and what is not, and to let go of what's not and focus on what is.
yeah.
So I think that's a good segue into another question that we intended to ask you. Many, if not all, mid-singles, in our experience, are dealing with trauma from past relationships, the pain that they've experienced, even childhood issues that might have contributed to blowing up past relationships. Those people with those issues are overrepresented, I think, in the mid-singles community, and we've had private conversations about that as well. So I have two questions against that background. One is, what can our listeners do to manage this and prevent it from contaminating future dating or marital relationships? And then secondly, what can they do to heal from the trauma?
Probably the first question is how they heal from trauma.
The first question, well,
Yeah.
but also how do you manage whatever trauma you still have?
Right.
to-
And then be able to move healthfully into a new relationship.
Yeah, well, let me maybe talk a little bit about that experience of childhood trauma. It's interesting. I mean, I didn't have a lot in my professional training through my PhD that focused on childhood trauma. I mean, I had awareness of things that you might call childhood trauma, but it's been over the course of my career, over the last 20 plus years, that I've really dealt a lot with that issue and done a lot of research with it. I mean, it's a particularly challenging point that can affect individuals in their adult relationships. But just having an understanding of what we mean by that, what does that look like, and have I experienced it? Just going through a learning process to understand that has resulted in some of the most aha moments of my life experience, as well as people that I share it with. So I think, starting to understand what you don't know, but affects you is a really important starting point. So about 20 plus years ago, there was a groundbreaking study done in California in partnership with Kaiser Permanente Health Association, and it examined the topic of what are called adverse childhood experiences in a very large, typical adult population. And what they found was shocking. The occurrence of certain experiences in childhood, such as, for example, growing up with a family member who was incarcerated, or a family member who had drug and alcohol addiction issues, or with parents who had intimate partner violence occurring, or if you as a child were victimized by physical or emotional or sexual abuse. All of these types of experiences were collectively termed adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And they were shown in this research to have a direct and very high correlation with the occurrence of physical, mental, and behavioral health issues far into adulthood. So not only did people experience much higher rates, not only of depression, which is a mental health concern, or alcoholism, which is a behavioral health concern, but of physical health problems such as heart disease, cancer, and a host of other health issues. And so this linkage between trauma in childhood and then the occurrence of something like heart disease, cancer, or other major physical health concerns in adulthood and later life was just a major linkage that was really unacknowledged and misunderstood prior to that. In the last 20 years, there's just been a wealth of research in this area, not only on understanding those linkages and why they occur, but on the whole topic of how to be resilient and heal from trauma, right?
So
and
for
what's
those
fascinating
with
What?
ACEs, so with those with ACEs, this all sounds really depressing. So tell us
It
the
starts
good
at,
news.
yes, it starts out. Yeah, I did a presentation on this a couple years ago for our staff. And I said, this is a 2-part presentation. We got to the end of the first 2 hours, and one of my staff members raised their hand and they're like, so is there any hope? And I said, just because you've had these experiences doesn't mean that determines your destiny. It's not doom and gloom. There's a whole nother part to the story, which is how do human beings be resilient in the face of this? And there's this whole other body of amazing research on resilience that shows that actually the protective factors in your life, even if you experience childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences, the protective factors in your life, or what we might call resiliency factors, they are much more predictive of your long-term health outcomes than if you've had the experience of trauma. Does that make sense? So that's to me is what is so amazing, is the things that help you to flourish, the things that help you to be resilient are much more powerful. And one of the most powerful things is our positive social connections with others. That's probably the most powerful, is positive social connections with others. And we find, for example, with kids, if they just have one caring adult in their life, they're much more resilient than they would be otherwise. A healthy spiritual life is a tremendous protective factor. It's tremendously helpful with resilience. So there's things like that we kind of take for granted, as being part and parcel of the fabric of our faith experience as Latter-day Saints, that are actually tremendously important to help people heal from and overcome childhood trauma. So I would say a very basic place to start. So now, having a little bit of that background, is starting with some assessment. What has been your past childhood experience? People need to acknowledge it, and they need to give attention to it if some type of healing is needed. And I think there's a lot of people who can tell you that unacknowledged trauma is a poison, that it's like a long-acting poison that slowly seeps into the person's health and into their relationships, and it will come out in negative ways if it's unacknowledged and undealt with. I mean, it's kind of like a slow spreading cancer. You may not notice the effects early, but if you leave it unattended, over time it will wreak havoc on your health. And so the same is true with I think unattended childhood trauma often. And for example, I mean, I had a friend who, in their marriage relationship, their partner showed all the signs of the way they would react to things in the relationship, showed all the signs of having unattended childhood trauma. And the problem was that, their coping mechanism was simply to avoid any attempt to deal with that unacknowledged trauma. And as a result, it just resulted in more pain kind of flowing out into the relationship, and more dysfunction over time, and just that unwillingness to acknowledge that they had experienced something in childhood that was painful or damaging, allowed it to continue to wreak its negative influence on them and how they were dealing with the world and stresses in the relationship. So getting to that starting point, whether it's with a counselor, a doctor, or something, and it's becoming basic medical practice to screen for childhood trauma. You can ask for it at your medical office. So that's a very important starting point. And then the next step is really, go ahead, Gavin,
we found EFT to be really helpful in releasing trauma. I mean, there were some things Jeff and I, when we were first married, we couldn't talk about without arguing and getting really frustrated and not being able to resolve anything. And then we went to EFT on our own, individually, to a therapist, and just released some trauma from our past. And some of it, I think, has to do with trauma from previous relationships, as well as childhood. And all of a sudden, and forevermore, though, that is no longer a source of tension for us at all. like that. It was amazing how much progress we made without even doing any therapy specifically on that issue, just getting trauma out of our bodies and allowing ourselves to let that go.
Yeah, there are some very good therapies available, and they're continued to develop evidence-based therapies. I would encourage people to be open to evidence-based therapies that can be very powerful, as well as, for some people that they look at and consider other complementary therapies that are available to them for healing from trauma. That's important. I think one thing that's really important is to learn. It really does require some learning. If you've experienced trauma, it's very important to learn what are the patterns that tend to emerge from childhood trauma, because part of what happens is that it affects your development as an individual and the way you respond to stressful events. And so, for example, you might perceive a threat where no threat exists. So like in a conversation with a partner that is actually a fairly normal interaction, you might perceive something as negative when it's really not intended as negative, or you tend to have a response that is, we call hyper responsive. Okay, so it means that you have an over the top negative response to something, and it's hard for you to come back to a normal baseline of functioning. So an event that might be for a couple who hasn't experienced childhood trauma, an event that might just be a typical, hey, we're mad at each other for a little while and then we come back to normal functioning. For someone who's experienced childhood trauma, their stress response system is developed in a way that it's hard for them to come back down to that normal functioning. They might carry that high level of perceived threat and a high level of like emotional arousal and anxiety for not only hours, but days, and not come back down to, hey, are we okay with each other? I mean, what you guys have read some of John Gottman, for example, and his 7 principles for making a marriage work. And he talks about, hey, coming back down to like what we call a repair attempt, which is just kind of normalizing. Are we okay now? Like we had this little spat, but hey, are we okay? And you don't come back down to that necessarily easily if you've been victimized by childhood trauma that makes the way your mind and body respond to a stress event hypersensitive and enormously powerful. And like there's nothing that you did that was wrong when you were growing up to develop this way. It's just what happened to you and how your system naturally developed in response to that, which might be adaptive at the time, but then becomes unhealthy as you grow up and you learn to cope with events. So if you can learn to understand, why am I perceiving things negatively when really, my spouse was saying something and it wasn't meant like to hurt me, or it wasn't meant in a aggressive way, but why do I perceive it that way? Or why do I respond in a way that's really aggressive towards them? Or why do I feel like I got to avoid a situation that makes me anxious, but I know I should talk about this, but I just can't.
Right.
Why is this happening? And if you start to understand those things, and then with the help, you can get help with different kinds of therapies. We've talked a little bit about that. They can be very helpful in starting to overcome that and heal from that. Now, there's a whole variety of things that you can do to heal from that, but having an understanding of the why and what is happening and why, to me is very helpful, because then you can start to, quote, take charge. You still have agency.
Yeah.
But you can start to take charge of that. But it's very much a learning process that I think you often need to go through.
Well, and I think that we, the mid-singles with previous relationship trauma, I think all of what you're saying applies to them, both in their, to look back all the way to their childhood, but also back to previous relationships, and that the solutions are the same. And I know I've been on the receiving and the giving end of those kind of traumatic conversations where, I said something and it was perceived from the child in my spouse. I've experienced it with Jeff and former relationships. And then I've also been even recently, where Jeff said or did something that really triggered trauma in me. And I was crying and I was upset, and I knew that it was irrational because I'm aware enough to know that it wasn't him, that it is in me. But I still isn't pleasant. And he's really good about recognizing it too, so that we can, be there for each other when that happens. But I wanted to mention that the first 8 of our 20 chapters of intentional courtship are all about establishing peace, because we believe that part of intentional courtship and even being able to move into healthy relationships is establishing peace within oneself, and to be able to face these traumas and be aware of them. Like you said, name them, be aware, and then be able to use our agency to make different choices. I love everything you said about that. It was great.
Well, and I would say one of the things that I found unique about your book was that you address that, very explicitly and helpfully, and helping people understand that taking a healthy self into a future relationship is important for a healthy future relationship, especially if you have experienced trauma in past adult relationships, like a marriage that resulted in divorce or something like that. And so focusing on your individual health, whether not just your mental health, but your spiritual health, and how to do that, I think is one of the kind of hallmark themes of intentional courtship that I would recommend to people. Is that, they'll not only get a book that helps them to think about, okay, what might my dating experience be like as a mid-single, but what can help me to be healthy in that dating experience, or to prepare for a healthy future marriage. I mean, so there's a lot more in there that I think is very helpful for folks.
Thank you.
That I would recommend.
I thought I just mentioned the subtitle of our book, Intentional Courtship, is A Mid-Singles Guide to Peace, Progress, and Pairing Up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it is divided into those 3 sections of peace, making progress with dating relationships, and then pairing up, and really being intentional about choosing your eternal companion.
And the way that your relationship will develop with that person together. One thing that struck me while we've been talking, and it reminded me of something that happened, Kathy mentioned even recently, she's had experiences with trauma, and I have too. I mean, we both brought some into our marriage, but we've both done a lot of work on it. And, the thing I think she was thinking of recently, I mean, we had this mundane task. We needed to change our passwords at the bank. The bank had requested it. I was doing it my way and she was doing it her way, and something in that triggered her, and she was crying. And
I even we laughed about it too, because I was crying and laughing at the same time, because I was upset and I knew that it was ridiculous.
And I said to her in that moment, "What are you afraid of?" And, I put my arms around her and said, "This is going to be okay. We're going to both know what the password is. We're going to be fine. This is not something we're going to have a huge conflict about. We're okay." Well, the trauma episode, for lack of a better word, lasted about 10 minutes, not 10 hours or 10 days, or 10 months. And I think what you talked about, Claire, at the beginning of this discussion on trauma is a little bit of understanding of what's happening and being able to recognize it in yourself.
And in your partner.
And in your partner helps to shorten those episodes, because you realize, okay, I'm not really thinking rationally. One other thing, when you talked about something like a normal baseline of functioning, my new word for that is shalom. Because shalom means peace, but it means more than that. It means wholeness, and it means restoration. And so I think at a deep level, I've got to know when I'm experiencing shalom,
or when you're not,
and when that is disrupted in some way. And when I'm functioning from a disrupted point of view, I can better understand that I'm not seeing the world the way it is right now. I am not seeing things with real perspective. I am seeing things through the lens of fear.
Right. Or if you're hangry, you eat a little bit and all of a sudden the world is more clear.
Yeah, I would bring up also one reason why this developing this sense of understanding of how I am responding or perceiving things because of an experience of trauma. It's not only important to understand it in yourself or a potential marriage partner, but in your kids. Because kids who have gone through an experience, it might be a loss experience with the loss of a parent, why someone may be single. It may be, they've gone through the loss experience of parents getting divorced. So children that you are parenting will have experienced trauma, and they will be responding in ways that, if you understand, oh, they're responding out of trauma rather than out of, they're choosing to be, they're choosing to be defiant or whatever it is. Oh, you're like, oh, wait, this is what is going on. It can really help you be more patient and purposeful in your parenting. And that's really important as well. So there's a lot of benefits that come from that. I would say one of the most useful insights for me spiritually, as I worked with people in a gospel setting, a church setting, is helping people understand the vast dimensions of the atonement of Jesus Christ that apply to this particular issue. We often construe the atonement as being primarily or only about the issue of
Sin.
our personal repentance for individual sin. And while, of course, it certainly applies to that, at the same time, part of what the Savior experienced was, in a sense, through the atonement, was that he experienced what it meant to be victimized by the sinful choices of others beyond our own individual control. And not only did he experience that, but he has infinite power, compassion, and wisdom to be able to assist us when we have been victimized by the sins or negative choices of others beyond our control. That's what we call trauma, right? And the atonement has immense power to help us heal from that, just as it helps us heal from our own, individual sins. And we don't talk very much, or as much as we should, I think, about that side of the atonement. And yet it's plentiful in the scriptures. And of course, part of the reason, it talks about in the Book of Mormon why the Savior experienced that is so that he could succor us in the midst of our pains and our difficulties. And to succor us means to run to us, to assist us, to help us overcome those difficulties. And part of the way he does that is through enlightenment, by helping us spiritually understand why we are fearful, why we are angry, why we are reactive, but also help us gives us the power and the ability through grace to be able to be less that way, and to develop more towards wholeness that Jeff is talking about in the way we perceive and respond to those things. So the atonement's a tremendous resource for people as well in those circumstances.
I love that you brought that up, because really that is the ultimate resource. Everything else can go around that and be amplified and supported by really where the power is. And I actually myself personally think a lot about the healing power that is there. But I also that enabling power to make changes and to become more aware of our subconscious behaviors and triggers. That is such a profound statement, Sean. Thank you for sharing that.
Is your question about trauma?
No, I just have one question at the end. We're going to start wrapping up.
Yeah, let me throw out one more question about trauma, and then I have another question that's a little bit lighter. But many mid-singles are seeing red flags everywhere when they're out trying to date. And a big part of this, there's a lot of mid-single experience, I think, related to sexual problems in prior relationships. And I think this is compounded by the fact that sex can be kind of a taboo subject in our religious culture. And we almost always discuss it paired with sexual sin. And so I think if you have an unshareable problem, and I think you're the one who gave me that verbiage, unshareable problem, it becomes bigger and it grows. So with that in mind, how can a mid-single during, living a celibate life and yet hoping for a future marriage manage that situation in a way that prepares for a healthy sexual relationship in the future?
Yeah. You mentioned early on in the introduction that I was a pretty reserved person on the topic of physical affection in my early life, and it does mean I didn't date or hold hands. I did those things, but reserved just happened that my first, kiss was with the young woman who became my wife, and we're still married, 30, nearly 31 years later. But I did understand, because I saw it modeled in my own home, as well as talked about the importance of a healthy approach to sexual intimacy, and that being one of the key building blocks of preparing for a happy and successful marriage relationship.
Yeah, your dad was very open about such things. He was a stake president, but he didn't mind talking about how much he liked sex.
No, not to give too much information, but he and my mom had a quote bumper sticker on the door to their shower that said "Sex cures headaches." So, it was kind of approached with a fairly healthy mindset. That this is not an unmentionable, it's interesting. Hubie Brown, who was a member of the first presidency back in the 60s, wrote a book called You and Your Marriage. In there, he said that there's too many Latter-day Saints who think of sexual intimacy as a quote unmentionable misfortune that befalls them when they enter a marriage relationship. And then he kind of rebuked that and said, this is not a healthy mindset with which to approach the marriage altar. Well, so a number of years,
people are excited about that.
Yeah. Well, people have varying experiences, and some people bring trauma, and this is a very sensitive issue. If someone brings childhood trauma related to sex,
or trauma from a prior marriage,
or a prior marriage, it can be a very very challenging thing. So it's very important to be sensitive to that. But I wrote an article online for Meridian Magazine years ago for an LDS audience, and it was called "Fulfilling the Sexual Stewardship in Marriage." And I had taken that terminology from a former professor of mine named Brent Barlow, who had referred to the idea of a sexual stewardship in marriage. And what I tried to frame about that is to understand that, our Heavenly Father has endowed us with a number of things as we go through our experience in mortality. And of course, the potential for partnering with someone and sharing a sexual experience with them is one of those. And it's a very extremely powerful thing, and very powerful. It can be very powerful in a negative way, and it can be very powerful in a positive way. But just that there's immense power that is gifted to most individuals in life, that relates to how we express our sexual powers, right? And so that becomes a stewardship when you are given something that has great potential, and you have to make choices relative to how you exercise that. That's kind of what we define as a stewardship. But we don't typically think of our sexuality or sexual intimacy and marriage as a stewardship. But I think it's a very powerful image to think about, okay, what what comes with that stewardship? What does that mean? And if you have a stewardship like that, but you don't really understand how to fulfill the functions of that stewardship, what you are responsible for, or how to carry out that stewardship, then it's probably not going to be, you're not going to be able to fulfill all of the things that are possible with that stewardship. And so having some essential knowledge is really important. John Gottman years ago in a book that he wrote, and I'll just say John Gottman is a pioneering researcher on marriage, but in a book he talked about 4 communication patterns that are highly predictive of the potential for divorce, and he called these negative communication patterns the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And in my article, I came up with 4 things that I called the 4 horsemen of sexual apocalypse in marriage, or in preparing for your sexual stewardship in marriage, which are going to make you much less successful. And those 4 things were ignorance, inhibition, ill will, and immorality, right? And these are things that can really derail us from having a healthy approach to sexual intimacy in a marriage relationship. And so the converse is the opposite of those things will help prepare us for success. So, the opposite of ignorance is going to be a willingness to learn, a healthy understanding of our bodies, of sexual intimacy, of how we function, as men and women, as partners, things like that. That's really important. Inhibition is kind of, that we're unwilling to engage, those powers. And Jeff could rightfully accuse me of inhibition with kissing the young women who I dated prior to marriage. But there's a place for inhibition, obviously, as you're preparing for marriage. And as Jeff said it, that you're having some control over how you express that part of your life when you are a single person in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, and the trick is, if you've been married before, you go back to living the law of chastity and being more inhibited. And then if you get remarried, then you become less inhibited or uninhibited, and you do the opposite, whether you're married or not, or if you're married versus if you're not.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to understand is that inhibition is not necessarily a negative thing. It's like, Jeff referred to earlier that he and I both had the experience of growing up in ranch life to a degree. We both had experiences working with horses. I love horses. I still work with them today. Horses are unbelievably powerful, but you don't want to be just subject to the power of the horse. You can get hurt. I mean, you remember the story of Christopher Reeves, the actor who played Superman, and he was injured for life after a fall from a horse that was out of control. So with a horse, you have a system to govern and guide that horse. Okay, so you have a halter, you have a bridle, so to speak, and that bridle gives you reins that help you to steer and guide the power of that horse. You don't erase or eliminate the power of the horse, but you govern it, you guide it, you control it. And I think the same is true when referring to sexual intimacy, that it's meant to be guided and controlled. And if we do that in a way that our Heavenly Father encourages, it will prove to be a tremendous blessing to us. And so understanding that potential, and it's meant to be expressed in marriage. So for me, I guess the complementary notion to inhibition, I guess, is having an accurate understanding of our Heavenly Father's plan for sexual expression in marriage, and being prepared for that, understanding, and there's a lot of statements from different church leaders across time that basically say what Hugh B. Brown said, and saying, look, God did not intend this to be an unmentionable misfortune in marriage. It's meant to be a beautiful, God-ordained expression of love and caring for each other. But you need to be and you need to be prepared for that expression when the time comes.
Well, and I think being able to keep that in mind when you are single and living
Right.
the law of chastity, to be able to have a healthy mindset about sexual relations and be able to look forward to it, as you know, that can build our hope. I think is believing that that is a gift we can one day have again, rather than just feeling deprived all the time, or whatever, you know, you might be experiencing in that. But I think let's go back to because I love the antidotes of the apocalypse. So the antidote of ignorance is education, right? And inhibition
Willingness
is,
to learn.
what did you say? Inhibition would be
An accurate understanding of God's plan for sexual expression in marriage.
okay.
Right?
And then what's the third one?
So the third one is ill will. And ill will to me was just kind of a catch-all term for things like emotional or verbal abuse, inattentiveness, apathy, isolation, anger, all these forms of negativity that couples might practice on each other. And then they perpetuate these feelings of hurt or these ill feelings or willful hurt. And there's no aspect of a marriage relationship that's more sensitive to emotional upheaval than the sexual relationship. Like two partners, like one partner can go from hot to cold very quickly if these emotion, you know, in other words, their emotional readiness for and willingness to engage in a sexual relationship can be derailed pretty quickly by an unkind word, by a flash of anger, by all of these small expressions of ill will towards one another that can occur.
Which would be motivation to be kind in a marriage.
So that's right. So kindness, consideration, and care are the essential antidote to ill will. You know, an angry word is likely to pour cold water on your spouse's romantic on switch pretty quickly, you know.
Right.
While things like kindness, an apology, consideration for someone, that's an invitation towards, hey, I love you. I'm loving you verbally. I'm loving you emotionally. This is also an invitation to love you physically. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So those are the things I would say are the antidote to ill will. Ill will sabotages the fulfillment of sexual love in marriage, whereas kindness and consideration is the reverse. And
right.
it paves the way towards fulfillment in that arena of marriage. So
and remind us the fourth one and tell us the antidote.
Yeah, so the first one I just call immoral. The fourth one I just call immorality. And immorality are things that are kind of like a higher level extension of ill will, but immorality includes things like unfaithfulness towards one's spouse, other kinds of sinful behavior that would be very alienating to one's spouse or to the health of a relationship, right? And so and as Jeff mentioned earlier, those sorts of things actually get the primary attention in talks on this subject in a church setting, because there's a responsibility to warn people about the tremendously negative effects of sexual sin, for example. But sometimes in the process, we lose sight of all these other things that are really important for a healthy sexual relationship. And if we don't talk about them, we're not going to be prepared to enact those things in a healthy way when we enter into a marriage relationship. And I told people, they're like, you didn't sleep with 20 women. I mean, I teach college students every day. So you didn't sleep with 20 women before you married your spouse. How did you know you could be physically compatible and all those types of things? And I said, just because I wasn't sexually active doesn't mean I didn't think about sex or I didn't talk about sex. Like I could, my religion allows me the freedom to learn and to talk about, to communicate about in a mature way, so that when I'm ready for that responsibility and I step into that, I'm ready to enact that stewardship. And it's like, I would compare it to the parenting stewardship. When Heavenly Father entrusts us with a child, that is a heavy stewardship, right? That's a significant thing. But just because you haven't taken on that responsibility before doesn't mean you can't prepare in a lot of ways for that stewardship
Right.
when it comes to
Absolutely.
you. Right?
Yes. And, so the antidote to your fourth apocalypse of immorality would be morality, would be obeying the commandments. It would be healthy
Right.
behaviors.
It would be living by the guidelines that come from our Father in heaven that are meant to govern that part of our life experience. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
And that will bring us, happiness.
John, I didn't
And
expect us to discuss this, but I love that you brought this up. We could have had a whole podcast just about these four. This is great stuff.
And maybe we will at some point.
I think he was going to finish something. Sorry.
Okay.
well, I was just going to say I'm a chatterbox, so certainly we could talk about it. But I will say, I also very much appreciate that in the book you've written that you bring up this topic pretty forthrightly of people's past experience with sexual intimacy in marriage, perhaps if they've had difficulty in that area, and things to prepare you for a healthy experience, if you want to enter marriage going forward, things that are going to be important for you, and I think that is the proverbial like elephant in the room sometimes, that sometimes the conversation for individuals who are single in the church as adults becomes, they feel like the only conversation point becomes, well, are you living the law of chastity? Which of course that's an important consideration, but there's much more in terms of their past experience and their future hope related to, they want to have a healthy rather than an unhealthy experience with sexual intimacy. We use the term intimacy because there's so many dimensions of that experience. It involves care for a person and an affection. It's much more than just the physical act of being with someone. People want it to be a meaningful, connected, loving, healthy part of their life. And that doesn't just happen by accident. It happens by preparation and intentionality. In intentional courtship, you guys talk about that, which I appreciate because I think it's an important part of the conversation for those who are currently living as single members of the church.
Yeah, thank you. And your cousin, it's your cousin, right? Or your
my cousin's wife,
Laura Brotherson,
Laura
wrote our
Brotherson,
forward, and she's a certified sex therapist and member of the church, and
I love to tell people, Laura learned everything on that she knows about that topic from me. Credit should be given where it is due. No, I'm teasing. She's a great resource on that topic.
Absolutely.
But yeah, she's addressed that very specifically with I think specific attention often to the perspective and needs of women with regard to that topic, which I think is helpful. I think it's very important.
Yeah. Well, so my question actually has to do with the book. Can I just so we each have one more
let me
question.
Just say one thing real fast.
Sure.
The core thing I'm getting from what you've been saying, and I mean, you said a lot. So, but the core thing,
it's all been great.
Yeah, the core thing I'm getting from what you said about preparing for marriage in that respect, in terms of sexual love, is doing some thought work, shifting our perspectives, and adopting a more positive way of thinking about it. Is that fair to say?
I think very much. You can have a perspective on the topic that is dominated by negative thinking or misunderstanding. But I think when you have a perspective that is informed by, I would say, a heavenly perspective on the topic, that is grounded not in a sense of asceticism, like, we don't want to touch sexual intimacy with a 10-foot pole, but we embrace it as a gift from our Heavenly Father with all the possibilities that are meant for a couple that is married to each other, that's a much more healthy way to approach it. But we need to be proactive in becoming educated about that.
Yeah.
I think when our Heavenly Father gives us a stewardship, he also expects us to do the homework that is necessary to productively fulfill and enjoy the blessings of that stewardship. He's not going to spoon feed it to us. We have a responsibility to do our spiritual and other homework to be able to carry out the things associated with that stewardship and to receive its blessings. And I think the same is true for sexual intimacy in marriage.
That's great advice. Okay, so here's my last question for you. You mentioned in what you wrote about intentional courtship, which is actually on the very first page of our book, which we are actually discussing the launch date. It will be out in just a few weeks. And in that statement you said you learned, you laughed, and you cried. And you believe our audience will too, and that our readers will when they read it. And I can think of some things you've said previously, but maybe you could just, for the benefit of our listeners, you could mention maybe one of each of those things. What did you learn? What made you laugh? And what made you cry?
Yeah, well, from a learning perspective, I just learned much more about the individual lived experiences of Latter-day Saints who are having that single experience, the depth of their experience, the hopes that they have, and and the hearts that they hope people will understand, with what they're experiencing. I mean, it was very informative to me as to that individual lived experience. And I think each of us wants to be understood. We hope that the people around us we often feel like if they could only understand what I am feeling, then my journey would be more meaningful. It would perhaps be more supported. And so that was, I think, the most important thing I learned is, what is the experience that someone may be going through? If they're a Latter-day Saint and they've gone through a divorce or another experience that is allowing them to experience life as a single member of the church.
So as a former bishop, would that have been helpful for you in working with your single members?
Yeah, tremendously helpful, because I think it's inevitable that you feel some sense of isolation when you're going through experiences where you feel like maybe not everyone around you understands what you're experiencing. And so to have a sense that people do have some level of understanding and a willingness to engage you and be more informed about what your life experience is, that's a very helpful thing. So I think that was
a gift.
That was important. As far as laughing, I love some of the stories that are told in there, both not only of successes, but of mistakes, right? Of mistakes that you may have experienced. As Jeff noted, he and I have known each other for many years. He makes way more mistakes than I do. No, I'm just kidding. Right? But just an honesty about, sometimes we make life mistakes, and some of them are little, some of them are bigger. And sometimes we just need to be able to laugh about those, right? We gain some perspective on those things. Like, I don't know, was it a mistake for me to only kiss Kristen and not another girl before her? I would say no, but Jeff might say, yeah, that was a mistake. You should have been a little bit more willing to kiss that other cute girl that you dated or something like that.
Well, he does like to tease you about it.
He teases me, and I'm sure Kristen would correct him and say, nope, he made no mistake in saving that kiss only for me, right? And then crying. I mean, I am a storyteller. I love stories. I do a lot of writing. I love to hear stories. One of my favorite kind of stories are love stories. In fact, in some of the classes that I teach, we start every class with a love story. I'm like, we're learning about relationships. Love is essential in relationships. Let's hear some great stories about love and couple or family relationships. Well, this book that you guys wrote has a lot of great stories in there. Some made me learn, some made me laugh, but to be honest, some of them made me cry, but it wasn't tears of like frustration. It was like
I would
tears
hope
of,
not.
that's a touching story. And of course, your own story as a couple coming together through difficult, painful past experiences and finding love together, to me is a story that made me cry, even though I was present for much of the story. I had the, privilege of being able to attend your marriage in the temple, to be there for your wedding reception, to visit with you afterwards. But it's a beautiful story because it speaks so much about the possibilities of love, and restoration and renewal and healing. And even though you may have experienced past heartache in a marriage experience. And so that made me cry. It really did. Cry tears of just my heart being touched and hopeful for people who want that experience. People will want different life experiences, but for those who are single and they hope for that life experience, I think it speaks to that possibility and reality and is touching. So all of those things are things that were messages to me from the book, and I hope that other people will experience as they have a chance to read it, and I'd invite them to do so. Fortunately, I got the advanced copy, so I gotta read it before most everyone else.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you experienced our love story like kind of at a different level reading about it. Is that right?
Yeah.
You could see the meanings we gave to everything, and
yeah, and it was, to me it was a really rich thing to be able to step further into the genuine experience that you each had and the journey that you had to travel, right, to come to that experience with each other. That was really meaningful.
Well, and quite a few of our advanced readers said it was one of their favorite chapters because it gave them hope, because we made so many mistakes. That, if we could find each other the way we, did things and the way we went about things and what we were dealing with, then it gave them hope.
Yeah, we try to give people the wise way of going about this in
chapters 1 through 19, and then chapter 20 is our love story, and then it kind of
we hope they have
it's real.
hope that if they make unwise choices from time to time or say or do something stupid, that all is not lost. There is still hope for a very happy ending.
Yeah, Jeff was the beneficiary of Kathy's patience when he did some dopey things along the way. And that gives hope to dopey people like me, and but really, I referenced earlier what we call repair attempts in relationships. And the fact of the matter is that none of us are perfect in our human relationships, in our relationships. Yeah, in our couple relationships where we're pursuing love, we make mistakes. We say things that are inconsiderate or unwise, and repair is necessary. Hope is necessary, that we can get from a place of, hey, we're not okay with each other right now, back to a place of not only we're okay, but we embrace each other, we love each other, and we're going to keep going on this journey that we've chosen together. Like hope is, at the heartbeat of what any marriage that wants to be a healthy marriage is about. Hope that you'll treat one another with kindness, and that the journey will be worth the investment that you're putting into it. And so, so your story and the story of overcoming mistakes and being patient with one another, forgiving of one another, allowing those repairs and healing to occur and being able to go forward. That's the story really of any relationship, or what it can be and what we hope it might be, and how the gospel helps us and how we can help one another in that process is, I think, much of the story of your book, and that I encourage people to pick it up. So
Thank you.
That's
Yeah,
awesome. And so we thank Dr. Sean Brotherson, our personal friend and a great expert in the field of human relations. We thank him for joining us on our podcast today. It's been very enlightening, and we hope you enjoy it. And remember, friends, anytime is a great time for more love in your life. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks so much for listening.